Welcome everyone. So today I'm very delighted to host Larry. I'll tell you who he is, but let me tell you a bit about why he's here. Larry Jackson is from Columbia University's core curriculum, and as you might all know, Savant University also has a core curriculum system called Foundations Development Program. And Larry, together with another colleague who is going to arrive this Sunday, Mark, they are assisting us in our self-evaluation after 25 years of core curriculum at Savant University. So we have this ongoing collaboration happening. Larry Jackson is Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, Director of the Center for the Core Curriculum at Columbia College, which is part of Columbia University, where he also teaches literature, humanities, and contemporary civilization. Prior to Columbia, Larry held positions at the New York School, the New York University, and the City University of New York. The New School, sorry. His writing has appeared in N+1, Diacritics, and the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, and he serves on the advisory board of Conversations, the Journal of Cavalian Studies. Originally from Philadelphia, Larry was the first in his family to attend college. He has a PhD in philosophy from the New School for Social Research, where he also received 2 master's degrees in philosophy and liberal studies. He received his bachelor's degree in American Studies from Skidmore College, and today he's going to talk about education and the crisis of democracy, lessons from John Dewey's 1924 visit to Turkey, which I think is super relevant for us today. Welcome, Larry.
So, thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here. It is a real pleasure and an honor to have this chance to speak with you, and I hope that I may refer to you all as a community of friends, and if I may be so daring, perhaps even a community of comrades in a struggle for the renewal of democracy in our time of crisis. I recognize fully the irony of my standing here before you today with this table between us, speaking rather monologically about the dialogical, participatory forms of education and politics. And I hope you'll forgive me for doing it this way. This is not my usual approach. In another life, I actually was a jazz musician. I love to improvise typically, and I love to move around quite a bit, but I'm not going to do either of those things today for exactly 3 reasons. First, I'm told that there is a camera there and a microphone that I need to be somewhere in the vicinity of. And if I'm moving around too freely, I will not be caught on camera or by the mic. 2, and a little more substantively, this is fairly new material that I have been developing, and in particular, my exploration of Dewey's time in Turkey and his report on Turkey. I'm delving into some areas that I don't know very well also about Turkish history and Turkish culture. And I don't want to lose credibility with all of you by saying the wrong thing, getting my facts wrong, and I also don't want to offend any of you. So I'm going to stay very close to the script. My 3rd reason for doing this is simply that I am very jet lagged. I'm on day 4 of my being here in Istanbul. I don't know how jet lag works for all of you, but for me, usually the first couple of days, I'm full of elation and energy. And by about day 3 or 4, I begin to crash and my brain stops functioning. So the possibility that I will start a sentence, forget how to finish that sentence is extremely high. So I'm going to kind of stay close to the script today, and I hope you'll forgive me for that. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote that he could offer only provocation, not instruction. I can only really speak with authority about my own experience and my own perspective. I hope that you will find some value in my experience and in my perspective. But I hope that you will recognize that I offer this to you, not in the spirit of instruction, but rather in that Emersonian spirit of provocation. And as I might amend Emerson or add to Emerson's thought, also an invitation for you to share your own perspectives, your own experiences, and your own ideas. Part of what I will talk about today also is the notion of democracy as hospitality. And I have received the kindest, most extensive hospitality probably in my life from, it seems like, everyone here in Istanbul. I have been fed, I've been provided with places to stay. I've been given wonderful recommendations for places to go. People have nurtured me with conversation, and they have welcomed me in spaces like this to share my own thoughts. So I owe quite a bit to all of you and to many people in Istanbul for this and other opportunities. In particular, I just want to thank my colleagues at the Columbia Global Center in Istanbul, not far from here, and the wonderful folks at Sabancı in the Foundation's Development Program, in particular, my good friend Emre, Ebru Selan, Arzu Kiran, and a special thanks also to the Istanbul Policy Center for letting me be here today and speak with all of you. I want to thank Harkan and Melissa in particular for their support today in putting together this talk. I know that these are hard times. I don't want to be overly optimistic, and I don't want to be naive, but I also want to note that I have been extremely inspired by what I have been seeing here in Turkey, in Istanbul, over the last few days. I have seen a beautiful city that is rich with diversity, that is very international. I have seen some amazing work that's happening at Sabancı University in education. I'm very proud of our partnership, our collaboration with Sabancı, and I'm very excited to see where that is going to go. I've observed conversations of earnest young people in places like Avasaraylar Park. And I think that while Dewey would have much to be concerned about if he were here in Turkey today, just as he would have much to be concerned about in my home country, in his home country, the United States, I also think that he would see quite a bit that would make him hopeful. And I think that that hopefulness, that optimism is really the mood of Dewey's philosophy and is also the mood of democracy. Now, having said that, I want to begin on a decidedly pessimistic note. These are dark times. It is clear that we are living in a moment of crisis for democracy. Throughout the world, the forces of reaction have risen to power, sometimes exploiting the mechanisms of democratic institutions. We might call that populism, but often manipulating, corrupting, and dismantling them, either from within or from without. At the same time, we are seeing movements emerge that are committed to a renewal of democracy and committed to experimenting with new forms of political engagement on our campuses, in our parks, and of course, in the streets. There was an old slogan in the US in the 1960s, democracy is in the streets. I think that that is very often true. Every crisis, I believe, is a turning point. And I think we must cling to the optimistic belief that the creative powers of people working and creating together can transform this moment of crisis into one of renewal for democracy. To gain some insight on our troubling historical moment, I would like to turn to the past, specifically to the work of philosopher John Dewey. In his speech, Creative Democracy, The Task Before Us, which Dewey delivered at another moment of crisis in October 1939, shortly after the beginning of the Second World War, Dewey argued that the creation of democracy is a perennial task that each generation in every free society is called upon to perform again and again. Dewey, known not only for his writings on democracy, but also for his active interventions in reshaping schools at all levels throughout the world, saw this task of permanent democratic revolution as being inextricably linked with the reform of education. And here I'm quoting Dewey, "Faith in democracy is one with faith in education." My purpose today is to speak about this faith, to consider the role that education might play in the face of the crisis of democracy that we are now experiencing, to imagine how it might renew our commitment to democracy and play a key role in the renewal of democratic life in the 21st century. To do this, I would like to examine a unique historical moment when both a new democratic republic and a new system of education were emerging in consultation with Dewey himself. I mean, of course, Turkey in 1924. I will first speak about Dewey's visit to Turkey, his recommendations about education here, and his observations about the newly formed republic. I will then turn to Dewey's philosophical writings to elaborate on his views about education and democracy. and end by considering what significance they might have for us today as we strive to renew our faith in democracy and education and commit ourselves to the renewal of democratic life. So to begin with Dewey and his visit to Turkey, as I'm sure all of you know, Dewey was one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. Richard Rorty, in his 1979 book, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, ranked Dewey up there with Heidegger and Wittgenstein. As a pragmatist, Dewey believed that ideas emerge from specific social contexts through cooperation. Their purpose is not, as the tradition of Platonism would argue, to reveal capital T truth to us, to explain the world as it really is behind the veil of illusion under which we mere mortals supposedly dwell, but rather to help us solve the problems that we encounter in the world. The measure of an idea, then, the test of an idea, is not whether it gets us closer to some independent metaphysical truth or reality, but rather whether it helps us to adapt to reality as we encounter it, to cope with the world, to grow by solving the problems that lie before us. So Emre said to me, very profound Deweyan points on the way here: freedom will triumph because freedom creates more human growth, right? It allows us to solve more problems. That's a very Deweyan insight. This is not to suggest that Dewey was a relativist. Dewey proposed, in place of the Platonic philosopher's conception of metaphysical truth, the idea of what he called warranted assertability. It's a mouthful, warranted assertability. We have an obligation, this is what Dewey meant by this. We have an obligation to justify our beliefs and our descriptions of the world to one another. And we possess standards and criteria specific to the different contexts in which we do this. So science, for example, enables us to solve a set of problems, and it has its own standards and criteria for assessing how successful a hypothesis is in doing so. Politics, art, philosophy, literature, religion are other tools that we as human beings possess and use to solve the problems that we encounter in the world. And each has its own context-specific standards and criteria that will gauge how successful we are in justifying our views to one another. So to try to provide scientific proof for something theological to the religious believer is to miss the point, right? The believer says, no, our belief is rooted in faith, right? It's rooted in belief. It's a different criterion, a different standard for assessing justification and the way in which we explain ourselves to one another. Dewey's pragmatism has three important implications for our discussion today. First, Dewey aligns philosophy with democracy. This is a radical break from a very long philosophical tradition. Disavowing Plato's philosopher king, whose political power is tied to an esoteric knowledge of transcendent truth, Dewey gives us an egalitarian picture of fallible human beings in dialogue with one another, attempting to justify their beliefs and their descriptions of the world to other people. If this sounds a lot like John Stuart Mill's account of a free democratic society in On Liberty, that is no accident. Democracy and the progress of knowledge are both concerned with communities engaged in discussion and debate. So that's the first implication. Second implication, because Dewey understands this dialogical justification of ideas, beliefs, and descriptions of the world to be relevant to both philosophical inquiry and democratic politics, it means that there is a necessary connection between democracy and education. It is crucial to note here, and I will hammer this point home several times, that this link between democracy and education in Dewey is not based on the view that smarter, better educated people are more democratic. We find smart, well-educated people among fascists II. The architects of one of the greatest atrocities in the history of my country, the genocide committed against the Vietnamese people, were all highly educated people from mostly Harvard University. Right? More to the point, we have seen some of the most inspiring democratic movements emerge from among the poor and uneducated. Here again, I would turn to the United States in the 1960s. And if you know anything about the Black freedom movement in the United States, Mississippi in the early 1960s, where illiterate sharecroppers knew much more about democracy than anyone else in the country and were risking their lives in order to be able to participate in democracy against white supremacy and Jim Crow segregation. Dewey is not suggesting that there are intellectual skills and competencies that are necessary to participate in political life. Such a view would merely be a recapitulation of the Platonic philosopher king and would prove antithetical to the democratic proposition of equality, which suggests that participation in democratic political life can have no antecedent qualifications. On the contrary, Dewey's views on education remind us of our fallibility and our need for one another. And in doing so, they offer an important counterbalance to elitism and other forms of exclusion. I'm going to talk a little bit more later, and some of you heard this yesterday, about what I think that fallibilism means also for our emphasis on expertise, both in modern technological society and in educational contexts. The third implication of Dewey's pragmatism for our purposes today is that the role of the philosopher is not to consider the fruitless metaphysical trivialities that have occupied thinkers for so many centuries, but rather to attend to the problems that we face in everyday life and in our social and political institutions and practices. This view led Dewey not only to write about democracy and education, but to intervene actively and directly in experiments with new institutions and systems. In 1896, Dewey founded the Laboratory School in Chicago, school that still exists, and was set up specifically to experiment with different modes and methods of education. In 1919, Dewey oversaw the founding of two institutions that have been extremely important for me personally. The first, the New School for Social Research in New York City, where I worked and also did my graduate work in philosophy, and also the core curriculum at Columbia University, where I am now. Dewey also taught at Columbia for 25 years. But that was not all. Dewey visited Mexico, Soviet Russia, China, Japan, South Africa, and of course, Turkey, where he advised newly formed governments on their educational systems. I'd like to turn now to Dewey's visit to Turkey in 1924 and his observations about both the nascent education system and the fledgling republic. Dewey was invited to Turkey. Here's where I have to make sure I get all my facts right. Dewey was invited to Turkey in March of 1924. I think the exact date was March 8th, 1924. This was just 5 days after the introduction of the law on consolidation of education, which placed schools under the control of the National Ministry of Education and offered a framework for proposed educational reform in the Republic. In subsequent years, the Ministry of Education would invite other educators from Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, and the United States. But given Dewey's global repute in the world of education reform, it is not surprising that he was the first person that the Turkish government invited, and that the invitation was extended so soon after the introduction of the new law on education and the establishment of the ministry. This is a fact that's, you get a couple of, I think it's a disputed fact. Dewey arrived in Turkey in July of 1924. A few people have said he arrived in June. I'm going to go with July because that's when I got here as well. So it helps me with my identification with Dewey. So Dewey arrived here in 1924. He stayed for 2 months. He was clear that he was not here to impose his views upon the Turkish people, but merely to offer recommendations that could be taken up by a new education system that would be bringing together the most successful elements and methods of several nations. We see in this already Dewey's anti-colonialism as well as his internationalism, and I'm going to develop those parts of Dewey's thought a little bit more in a few minutes. In the 2 months that Dewey was in Turkey, he traveled extensively, met with government figures, including Ataturk, spoke with teachers, and visited various educational facilities. Because it was summer, Dewey was not able to observe many classes in action, but his travels and his research seem to have yielded a rich understanding of the state of educational institutions in the newly formed Turkish Republic, the methods being used by teachers, and the aptitudes of Turkish students. There's a moment in his report where Dewey notes that he thinks that Turkish students have an amazing ability to draw and in visual art. And he recommends that this is something that be encouraged widely throughout Turkey. So those sorts of observations come into his writings about Turkey. Before leaving Turkey, Dewey submitted a brief preliminary report that focused primarily on the conditions of teachers in Turkey and offered some considerations for the Ministry of Education's budget. Among the proposals that Dewey made in his preliminary report and repeated in the later, fuller set of recommendations that he drafted once he was back in the United States were ensuring greater access among teachers to international literature about teaching and learning, the creation of reading circles and discussion groups for educators, traveling libraries for students, and the construction of new school buildings in accordance with the aims and methods of teachers. After returning to the United States in September of 1924, Dewey drafted a more extensive report for the Ministry of Education, which was published first in the Ministry of Education Review in 1925, again in that same journal in 1928, and then reproduced with new translations 3 more times in 1939, 1952, and 1960. Dewey's report has been described by those familiar with his educational philosophy as a concrete summary of his views, and I think that this is right. Yet, one of the potential weaknesses that I find in the 1924 report is that Dewey provides little theoretical justification for his concrete proposals. This is not surprising, of course, given the context and the purpose of this report. Nevertheless, it has, I think, meant that some of the reasons for these specific recommendations and their relevance to democratic life are not always clear. Dewey's underlying views about education and politics could appear murky, and as a result, they are open to misinterpretation and appropriation by figures with agendas very different from Dewey's. To offer one example of what I mean, Dewey's overall educational philosophy, the one that I'll be sketching out for us today, is known as progressive education. Dewey uses the word progressive no fewer than 12 times in his 1924 report, but in the multiple translations of this report into Turkish, this word is translated inconsistently and often, I would suggest, inaccurately. As Turkish scholar Yasemin Alpektin has pointed out, progressive has been translated into Turkish. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Turkish words. So again, I don't want to butcher your beautiful language, but I will say the closer translations, I think, to the English are developed, advanced, mature, improving, and efficient. Terms that are all far from Dewey's meaning of progressive, and in some cases antithetical to his conception of progressive education. Now, there is disagreement among scholars of education. I read every work I could on Dewey's visit before coming here. There's disagreement among these scholars as to how much influence Dewey's report had on the practices of Turkish schools generally. Some in the Ministry of Education thought that Dewey's views were too radical and sought to suppress his recommendations. For instance, after noting the importance of having the Ministry of Education coordinate schools throughout Turkey, Dewey adds this, and this is a long quote from Dewey's report. So he's just said, yes, the Ministry of Education needs to coordinate education throughout the land. On the other hand, there is a danger that too much and too highly centralized activity on the part of the ministry will stifle local interest and initiative, prevent local communities taking the responsibilities which they should take, and produce too uniform a system of education, not flexibly adapted to the varying needs of different localities, urban, rural, maritime, and to different types of rural communities, different environments, and different industries, such as pastoral, grain growing, cotton, fruit, etc. There is also danger that any centralized system will become bureaucratic, arbitrary, and tyrannical in action, and given to useless and perfunctory mechanical work in making useless records, requiring filing useless reports from others, and in general, what is termed in English, red tape. Yeah, tell us what you really think, Dewey. Dewey sometimes could be a very dull writer. And there are moments when Dewey's writing can be a real potent soporific. If you have insomnia, I can recommend a few Dewey texts for you. However, when he felt passionate about something, he pulled no punches and he told it like it is. And he's doing that here. So bureaucracy bad, right? Dewey's call for flexibility in education, allowing different regions to modify the otherwise consistently coordinated curriculum to meet their local needs, was deemed to be out of step by some with the top-down dissemination of official state ideology that at least some figures in the ministry preferred. This passage offers an example of one of the moments where greater clarity about Dewey's educational and political philosophy would be helpful, I think. The annoyances of bureaucracy are perhaps obvious to all of us, right? We live in an era of bureaucracy. We're surrounded by it. We're oppressed by it. But that impersonal institutions of any kind are antithetical to the vision of participatory democracy that Dewey offers in his philosophy is not so obvious. Similarly, the need for flexibility in the curriculum and responsiveness to the content in which students are, the context rather, in which students are learning, rural versus urban versus maritime, for instance, is not merely a matter of efficiency, but is central to Dewey's very conception of progressive education, which takes place in the continuum of life experience. Let me explain. Dewey writes that as living organisms, we grow by adapting to stimuli in our surroundings and communicating with one another. Dewey's very influenced by Darwin. He has a brief essay about the importance of Darwin to philosophy. So this is coming out of Darwin's influence. Not a social Darwinist, of course, as I think will become apparent. Education as a form of growth requires for Dewey the same responsiveness and adaptation to the stimuli of our immediate environment, which is why educational methods can never be uniform, but must instead be modified based on students' experiences, situations, needs, desires, goals, etc. Quote, this is Dewey speaking again in 1924 in his report, while Turkey needs unity in its educational system, it must be remembered that there is a great difference between unity and uniformity, and that a mechanical system of uniformity may be harmful to real unity. The central ministry should stand for unity, but against uniformity, and this is the most important part, in favor of diversity. Indeed, Dewey goes on to caution that uniformity in education that does not take into account the diversity of Turkish society would actually be harmful. While there's no consensus among scholars about the impact of Dewey's 1924 report, most agree that Dewey did exercise significant influence on important elements of the Turkish education system for decades, particularly in the areas of teacher training, in the social studies curriculum, and in the life studies curriculum. And as Emery and I were discussing last night, the village teacher schools established in 1926 and the village institutes created in 1940 until American paranoia about communism shut them down in the 50s, early 60s, right? These schools were significantly influenced by Dewey's views, and the number of educational reform laws throughout the 1920s and 1930s also seem to reflect Dewey's influence. Perhaps less measurable is the influence that Dewey's most famous treatise on education, simply titled Democracy and Education, has had on Turkish schools. First published in the United States in 1916, Dewey's Democracy and Education was translated into Turkish in 1928 and was a required text in teacher training for decades in Turkey. So now, having suggested that elaborating on Dewey's underlying philosophical views can help us better understand his proposals, I'd like to focus on a few more of the concrete recommendations from Dewey's 1924 report, as well as the 5 essays that he published about Turkey in the United States as a way to sketch out some of the philosopher's views on the relationship between education and democracy. Dewey opens his report with this, quote, "The first and most important point is to settle upon the aim and purpose of the schools of Turkey. Only when this is done is it possible to be clear upon the means to be used and lay down a definite program of progressive and gradual development." There's the first use of that word, progressive. So the goal and aim for Dewey is not going to be simplified vocational training. It is also not going to be the transmission of great cultural works from the past. He offers a suggestion here of what his educational philosophy is instead and how it relates to democratic life. As I noted earlier, Dewey sees education as continuous with our experience of living organisms. From the time we are born, we are learning. And doing so not because of the instruction we have received from authoritative teachers, but because of our natural responses to stimuli in our environment as living beings that adapt and grow, right? My daughter is 3 years old. I've been watching her just go through this explosion of language, right? That's not because of anything that we've been teaching, right? That's been because of her natural responses to the environment in which she's been growing. The child who touches a hot surface learns not to touch it again and communicates their pain and their need for soothing and care through crying. This continuity with experience is central to Dewey's critique of traditional forms of education, the 2 forms of education I mentioned a moment ago, which he also sometimes refers to as authoritarian education, right? Because they're rooted in the notion of authority. There's an authoritative figure or an authoritative subject that must teach the student. That's authoritarian education. That's what Dewey is against. Those 2 models, education as vocational training alone and the so-called classical education that is based on the study of a fixed canon of great books, both sever the learning experience from the life of the student. In place of such models, Dewey argues for a progressive conception that is centered on the experience, the needs, and desires of the student. In this way, education does not sit outside of the natural growth and experience of the student, but is immersed within it. I almost think of this as a great stream of vital living energy and growth, right? And instead of trying to imagine education as some separate set of prescribed knowledge that exists outside of that, education sits right in the midst of that stream of life and experience. Students engage in projects that are focused on solving problems that matter to them and affect their lives. Sabancı does this extremely well with their core science class. The purpose of, and Dewey would love that course. The purpose of education then is to refine and enhance the natural powers of adaptation and growth that each of us already possesses. And it is here that Dewey also finds a relationship between education and democracy. Dewey's report thus defines the aim of the educational system in Turkey to be the development of the country as a vital, free, independent, and lay republic in full membership in the circle of civilized states, end quote. It is important to note that Dewey does not claim here that education is preparation for democratic life, or the acquisition of skills and intellectual capacities that will earn one membership in the democratic polity. I don't know if this happens in the United States, in Turkey, but in the United States, the most frequent response that we hear whenever there is political dissent is these people are children. They are not competent to participate in politics. They are not rational. They are not reasonable. They do not speak the language of our politics, right? So Dewey is not trying to do that in his own view and say that there's a particular language or a particular way of speaking or a particular set of competencies that we need to have. Education does not prepare us for experience, growth, or democracy. Dewey argues in his philosophical writings that it is experience, growth, and democracy. So now our stream of experience flowing through education is also going to flow through democracy. What education does, according to Dewey, is to create a controlled space in which our natural powers of growth can be exercised through collaboration, experimentation, and discussion. The teacher does not transmit knowledge to students or impose discipline upon them, but rather gives them the context and the stimuli by which they will grow intellectually and socially. It is this collaborative endeavor, rather than the imposition of arbitrary authority, that provides growth and direction, right? Dewey's very concerned with the way in which we form an educational community, and it's the formation of that community that keeps us on task, that keeps us focused, that gives us direction. It's not the teacher with the ruler in hand saying, you must do the following. It's the experience of the community. If human experience is growth through response to stimuli, adaptation to challenges, and communication with others, then education is merely a structuring of natural experience. And it is a structuring of experience that we can and should carry on throughout our lives in various contexts, not merely as young people in schools. What then is democracy? Democracy, according to Dewey, is this same lifelong process of growth through inquiry, experimentation, and communication. The democratic society is the one that enables us to discover and to exercise our potential in cooperation with one another. This is why Dewey describes democracy not as a set of institutions, but rather as a way of life. I've been using this phrase a lot, democratic life, right? That's Dewey's preferred phrase. It requires a commitment to our own growth and that of others, regardless of their race, gender, class, sexuality, nationality, religion, or any other factor. If education is a structuring of human experience through the creation of a controlled environment in which growth can be coordinated through collaboration rather than authority, then democracy is the outward expansion of forms of cooperation and growth in ever widening circles. While Dewey never disavows liberalism with its focus on liberty and the development of individual intellectual powers through free expression and discovery, he seeks a renewed version of this philosophical view, which he sometimes calls fighting liberalism or radical liberalism as well. This is a view that moves beyond the individualism and negative conceptions of rights associated with many liberal philosophers like John Locke, and instead constructs institutions devoted to the growth of all members of society. Similarly, Dewey addresses the normative deficit of liberalism. This is the communitarian critique that we might get from a figure like Michael Sandel or Michael Walzer, the failure of many liberal thinkers to offer a positive conception of the good. And Dewey gets beyond this by describing growth not merely as a right, but as a way of making our lives better, making our world more livable, more interesting, more enjoyable. And unlike earlier liberal philosophers, Dewey does not view this process of expanding cooperative circles of growth as taking place through contractual agreements and arrangements, but rather on the basis of an egalitarian faith in others, a belief in their potential, and a concomitant care about their goals, their needs, their desires. So it's circles of care that Dewey is really describing as democracy here. It is with this intent that Dewey offers his specific recommendations for Turkey's educational system. Appropriately, Dewey's recommendations touch on all levels and forms of education, from preschool to the university level, from vocational training to the arts. Throughout his recommendations, Dewey evinces a concern both with the open internationalism that I spoke about earlier, He proposes, for instance, giving teachers the opportunity and the funding to travel abroad so that they could observe educational methods and practices in other countries, and the attention to the local needs and concerns of specific communities in keeping with his progressive educational philosophy. This is also a way of describing Dewey's commitment to democratic life. While the expansiveness of cooperation and care that Dewey identifies with democracy is his version of humanism, it never strays into the empty abstractions about a universal humanity that, as Hegel pointed out, all too often mask the agendas of particular groups. Nor does he reduce the universal impulse in politics to a hegemonic struggle. Rather, Dewey's internationalism recognizes the importance of diversity and attention to the local conditions in which learning and democratic life take place. Dewey's participatory vision of politics is perhaps best illustrated by an image from his speech, Creative Democracy, which I referred to earlier, and it's this, quote, "The heart and final guarantee of democracy is the free gatherings of neighbors on the street corner to discuss back and forth what is read in uncensored news of the day, and in gatherings of friends in the living rooms of houses and apartments to converse freely with one another." Dewey severed the association of democracy with institutions and moved it into the spaces of everyday life because he knew that anonymity, like bureaucracy, would breed apathy. That once people vacated the public square, no longer participating in democratic life, it would all too quickly be occupied by tyrants. Personalism, direct, active participation are therefore key both to education and democracy in Dewey's vision, even as a concern with expanding the forms of cooperation associated with democratic life counters the dangers of provincialism. So Dewey's always operating on two levels: the outward expansion to other people who are different from us, who don't live like us, who are in different worlds from us, and engagement on the very local level. Dewey's own care for people is apparent in many of his 1924 report's recommendations. He advocates, for instance, for better salaries and conditions, including housing for teachers. This was one of the most urgent concerns that Dewey had after meeting with members of the teachers' union in his 1924 visit. This speaks also to Dewey's sense about the integration of education into other institutions and democratic society. For some, education is viewed as a panacea for the ills that affect democracy in our time. Not so for Dewey. Education, insofar as it reaches a vast number of people and embodies the kind of growth that he associates with democracy, is crucial to the renewal of democratic life. But it does not take place in a vacuum. Other institutions, such as labor unions, which foster equality and help people realize their potential, are equally important. And education, if it is to be broad, diverse, and effective, must take place in many kinds of settings and institutions, not only in schools. So Dewey was a big advocate of things like worker education. Dewey's report thus includes references to healthcare and social service as institutions necessary for educational growth and democratic life. What I hope is becoming apparent here is the pluralism of Dewey's approach to both education and democracy. No one group, no one set of methods, no single institution, local or national, can lay exclusive claim to the growth that Dewey associates with education and democracy. Dewey's vision, rooted in his pragmatism, is of a ceaseless exchange of ideas among various groups and individuals. One of the most important tasks for us in reforming education and creating a democratic way of life, then, is to challenge authoritarian conceptions of truth that exclude people and perspectives from both education and political dialogue. In education, this means not offering a single subject to students, but rather exposure to a range of disciplines and ideas, giving them the opportunity to explore freely and to find pursuits that they care about and in which they can grow. And this, I think, is the best of a liberal education, like the liberal arts education given at Sabancı and the one that we offer at Columbia. Among Dewey's concerns in the 1924 report is the overly specialized training of teachers, which would inhibit their ability to create a more pluralistic educational environment for students and respond creatively to the diverse needs and goals of individual students in particular contexts. Education fails once it becomes overly prescriptive or overly normative. There is for Dewey no proper place to begin that can be decided in advance, no route that we can map out before the actual process of education has begun. Education proceeds experimentally, incrementally, iteratively. It requires adjustments, changes, adaptations. The most that we can do, we have to improvise. The most that we can do is to create an environment in which we expose students to a variety of subjects that they can pursue, developing their interests and aptitudes through such collaborative experimentation. In politics, Dewey's pluralism meant not reducing democracy to a single party or ideology. This is where Dewey's intent diverged from at least some figures in the Ministry of Education who considered his ideas too radical. For Dewey, education cannot be treated as a mechanism for the dissemination of a state ideology or even a fixed conception of citizenship with prescribed duties and responsibilities. So even I think the sort of most benign civics class that says, here's what it means to be a citizen of a democracy, I think leads us astray because it suggests that all of that is decided in advance, that there's an agreement about that. The creative element of democracy, remember Dewey's phrase in 1939 is creative democracy, which is necessary to the survival, even in the best of times, necessary to democracy's survival, even in the best of times, will yield through social experimentation, new forms of political engagement, new ways of seeing the world, new conceptions of citizenship, or I hope, and I hope that you hope too, something that might even go beyond citizenship as it is defined in the context of the modern nation state. A vision of political solidarity that includes exiles, migrants, refugees, others who are traditionally excluded from our societies. So much for the 1924 report. What I'd like to do now is just to touch very briefly on the 5 essays that Dewey published about Turkey, and then close with a few remarks about the relevance of all of this to the crisis that we face today. So I'd like to turn briefly to these essays. Dewey published these essays at the end of 1924 and beginning of 1925 in a magazine named, appropriately enough, The New Republic. Many of you may know this magazine. It exists still today. It has sort of oscillated between being a liberal and a conservative magazine over the decades. I think it's swung back to the left, fortunately, but it was very left in Dewey's time. These essays reflect some of the ideas that underlie Dewey's educational philosophy. And my hope is that by discussing some of the insights that Dewey offered in them, we might have a clearer picture of the relationship between education and politics in his philosophy. While each of these essays includes some mention of education, only 2 focus primarily on this topic. The first considers the considerable challenges of developing a secular system of education, while the second explores the distrust of foreign schools that Dewey observed among many people in Turkey in 1924. This distrust, which Dewey is sympathetic to, is rooted in the colonial and religious agendas that many foreign schools in Turkey had. It could, however, become an obstacle to international cooperation, which Dewey was urging in his report to the Ministry of Education. Both essays on education reflect what I will call Dewey's deep secularism. Raised in a strict Christian household, Dewey was a believer until age 30. After that time, Dewey, while always respecting the faiths of others, remained committed to a secular society in which religious institutions could not direct the political affairs or public education. He was alert to and very outspoken about the dangers of theocratic approaches to politics and education. And in a third article that Dewey published in the New Republic on the conflicts between various ethnic groups in the region and the persecution of ethnic minorities in Turkey, Dewey lays a great deal of blame for this violence on religion. His harshest judgment is directed at the adherents of his former faith, Christianity. Now, secularism is, of course, a basic tenet of liberal democracy. The reason that I call this basic tenet of liberalism deep secularism in Dewey's case is that I think it extends to a broader anti-authoritarian view. Dewey would not replace God or religious institutions with other more worldly authorities, be they intellectual or political. Unlike those philosophers of the Enlightenment who wanted scientists to take the place of priests, Dewey wanted a society and he wanted schools without masters. In philosophy, Dewey was an anti-Platonist. He was opposed to the philosopher king. In education, he was a pluralist in subject matter and approach, and an advocate for collaborative effort rather than the imposition of authority on the part of the teacher. In politics, he was a true radical small d Democrat. The small d, I have to say that in the United States because we have the Democratic Party. So I don't mean that he was a radical member of the Democratic Party, but a true believer in democracy. Against the monological authoritarianism of the various intellectual, religious, and political ideologies that he opposed, Dewey would call for a dialogical anti-authoritarianism in all areas of human life. In this vein, Dewey's essays for the New Republic evince his hostile disdain for colonialism. He blames much of the violence against and persecution of ethnic minorities taking place at that era in many different places on the manipulation of populations by the great colonial powers of Europe. At the same time, Dewey rejects nationalism, viewing it as an inadequate response to colonialism. Colonialism and nationalism are both authoritarian in Dewey's view, both monological, both antithetical to the kind of open-ended society and institutions that Dewey seeks to promote. Dewey's commitment to an open internationalism is also apparent in my favorite of the 5 essays that he published for the New Republic, an essay titled Angora the New. Here, Dewey laments the shifts, the movement of Turkey's capital from Istanbul to Ankara, not due to any criticism of Ankara. He actually spent several weeks there while he was visiting, but out of a concern that this change from a seafront city to one that is landlocked suggests a turn away from a community of nations. For Dewey, Istanbul as a city on the water embodied geographically, historically, and culturally the openness and the internationalism that he promoted in his writings on education and politics. And again, just based on my experience here and my observations, I'm inclined to agree with him. While Dewey rejected the impositions of foreign colonial powers, he thought that any society promoting the growth of human potential must be open to the world and engaged in an international dialogue of equals. So what I'd like to do just for the last couple of minutes is to conclude by just offering a few thoughts on what we might do with this today, what this might mean for the project of reforming education, something that I am deeply committed to, and I know Sabanji, my friends and comrades and colleagues at Sabanji are committed to, and also the renewal of democratic life, democracy as a way of life. So what can we learn from Dewey's visit to Turkey in 1924 that might renew our commitment to democracy in the face of global crisis? I have spoken already about the collaborative growth that Dewey identifies with education and what he called in 1939 creative democracy. To create democracy anew, we must believe in the potential of one another and seek new mechanisms for working together to encourage individual growth and experiment with new social and political institutions. We must, in other words, view democracy not as a set of norms and institutions, but as a way of life. Democracy is, in Dewey's view, lived together rather than legislated from afar by anonymous institutions. This means for Dewey that the crisis of democracy is with us not only in moments like ours, when we are confronted with revitalized forms of fascism throughout the world, but even in the best of times, when our institutions are stable and functioning without the threat of authoritarianism or theocracy. The moment we cease to participate in what John Stuart Mill called experiments in living, in which we engage directly with others in trying out new ways of organizing our communities, the moment that we stop having those conversations with others that Dewey describes, the quote I used earlier, we have lost our democracy. Institutions can at best be expressions and extensions of this vital democratic way of life, Dewey argues. So this is why I said earlier, I think democracy can be found mostly in the parks and in the streets, right? That's where these conversations are taking place. That's where these experiments are occurring. In 2011, the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York City was doing just that, right? Trying to experiment with new forms of organizing our communities, new ways of having values in our society beyond simply profit. One of the great threats to democracy, then, is the emergence of what Dewey calls the Great Society, our tendency towards anonymity and a growing distance from those neighbors and friends with whom we might engage in discussions and debates, keeping the vitality of democracy alive. Dewey is not naive. As much as his vision of participatory democracy is rooted in the local conversations that we might have with one another in parks and streets, he knows that we must also find ways of translating those ideas and experiments into wider reaching, ever expanding spheres, which is why Dewey advocates for constructing within the shell of the Great Society what he calls the Great Community. It is here, in the transition from democracy as a way of life into the ever-widening great community, that I see the reform of education helping us to renew democracy. Education can not only help us to develop and direct the capacity for growth that each of us has, and renew our faith in the potential of one another through our exchanges, it can also widen our spheres of cooperation and care through fostering a moral imagination that the literary critic, Columbia University professor, and Deweyan thinker Lionel Trilling argued was the beating heart of liberalism. Trilling's most famous book was called The Liberal Imagination. And he argued that liberal institutions are empty and meaningless without that moral imagination at the heart of them. Education at its best then can expose us to a range of topics, ideas, perspectives, and experiences. We can adopt them, challenge them, experiment with them, reject them, critique them. And in doing so, we not only gain clarity about our own cares, needs, desires, goals, and aptitudes, but we also gain some perspective into the lives and experiences of people who are very different from us. If education can renew our commitment to democracy and help us to create a great community based on a democratic way of living together, it will do so not by making us smarter, but by making us humbler, more generous, more hospitable, which is to say, more receptive to the concerns, experiences, ideas, and pain of others, better able to understand their challenges and ambitions, of people who do not look like us, who do not live like us, and right now seem to inhabit worlds very different from our own. I want to be clear. I am not rejecting the importance of expertise or the role that must be played in our world by experts. The great community, as Dewey describes it, does not destroy the highly advanced great society and its need for experts. But our technical expertise must be augmented by the humility and pluralism that enables us simply to listen to others. Let me offer a brief example of what I mean. Some of you heard me speak about this yesterday. I'm going to speak from my own context in the United States, a country that, as I'm sure you know, is very divided at the moment and in danger of losing what I would call our always imperfect, but always evolving democracy. And that evolution has been, I think, our abiding hope and our abiding civic faith for centuries now. And it is at great risk. It became clear during the pandemic, the kind of crisis that once made Americans roll up their sleeves and work together, just how deep our divisions ran. just how differently we saw the world. As the science became clear that masking and vaccinations worked in reducing the risk of transmission and the severity of COVID, millions rejected these conclusions, refusing both masks and vaccines. The reasons for this reaction are complicated. I do not claim to know what all of them are, and I do not claim to be able to address them adequately here or anywhere. But among the reasons sometimes offered, I unequivocally reject the idea, often floated in more educated elite circles, that those people who would not mask or receive vaccines were simply stupid. Such a view gives up on the faith in the potential of others that Dewey sees as central to democratic life. I wish to suggest instead that at least some of the resistance to masks and vaccines during the pandemic was a result of the alienation that many in the United States felt from the experts and the medical and political establishments that were advising them to do these things. And I would further suggest that these feelings of alienation can be understandable to us if we take the time to investigate their causes, which is to say, if we take the time to listen to what people are telling us. Many of the communities that rejected masking and vaccines had long, ugly histories with the medical establishment. For years, rural communities in the United States have endured an epidemic of opioid addiction, which has killed thousands, ravaged entire communities, and was caused not by the smuggling of illegal drugs into the country, the kind of thing that Trump likes to harp on, but by legal medications prescribed by doctors and promoted by a for-profit industry that was reaping in lots of money as people got sick, addicted, and died. I am not rejecting expertise, nor am I defending pseudoscience, but I am suggesting here with Dewey that each of us is an expert about our own lives, in the matters that touch us most closely, in our needs, our pains, our goals, and our desires. If we are to create democracy again in the face of our present crisis, we must know why so many people are lining up against us, using the very mechanisms and institutions of democracy to destroy our democratic way of life. This will require that we listen to them when they tell us about their lives and not give up on the hope that we might, in doing so, renew their commitment to democracy as a way of life. That we not give up on the perhaps naive belief that we can, through dialogue, expand the moral imaginations of those who fail to recognize the needs of refugees and migrants, of ethnic minorities, of members of the LGBTQ community, of workers and the poor. I am not naive enough to believe that this alone will solve the crisis of democracy. We need labor unions. We need a fairer, more equal distribution of wealth. We need protest and dissent and a host of other political mechanisms and institutions. But fostering the great community in each of these spaces is a necessary part of creating democracy and maintaining our faith in its possibilities through the darkness of our time. Education, when carried out in many different ways and in many different contexts as a lifelong project, is, in my view, one of the best ways in which we might embark on this project of renewal. Like Dewey, I believe that one of the greatest prophets and theorists of democracy was Walt Whitman, and that his poetic, prophetic expression of liberty, equality, and solidarity in Song of Myself is one of the finest expressions of democratic belief and one of the finest elaborations on democratic life, as we might aspire to live it. I will close then, as any good anti-Platonist should, by giving the last word not to a philosopher, but to a poet, one of those excluded by Socrates in Plato's Republic from the authoritarian city, left to create a new way of living and a new community in exile with other outcasts. Whitman, like Dewey, knew that if we are to create a democracy, we must hear the voices of those outcasts. We must welcome the stranger. We must care for the refugee. We must attend to the needs of the outsider. And we must listen to the silenced voices of the despised and the rejected. Here is Whitman, through me, many long, dumb voices, voices of the interminable generation of prisoners and slaves, voices of the diseased and despairing, and of thieves and dwarfs. They speak, but do we hear them? Education can make us listen. Thank you. Do we have time for some
I think so.
discussion
Thank
and
you very
questions?
much, Larry. We can entertain some questions, I think, as long as you have the energy.
Oh yeah, I'm just getting started. This is great. So what did I get wrong?
Any questions? Any reaction? Matt?
Hi, sorry, I'm late, so
Oh, no.
maybe you have already talked about the stuff that I want to ask about, but 1924
Yeah.
is a really interesting date.
Yeah.
Especially in the context of discussions of democracy, education, because at the time when he visited Turkey and talked about, as he suggested, the dangers of centralization, work of need for flexibility, for the local communities, the Klan was rising in the United States.
Yes.
And it was, unlike the 60s, it was not something limited to the South, but it was pretty strong outright in the Midwest.
Yeah.
And that was also the year when even the Democratic Convention fails to, the distance between them because they got so strong and penetrated civil society and involving them.
Yeah.
So, like when I think about these two in tandem with each other, I see kind of a conflict, and I wonder if another writings that you have studied, he might have talked about it in that perspective. Because I can see the authoritarian tendency in a centralized system as Hitler. But the reverse is also true that you can actually use flexibility and the needs of the locality to be quite authoritarian.
Absolutely.
So how did he manage these two different angles?
That is an excellent question. So it's important to note that Dewey is traveling quite a bit during this era. He's not spending as much time in the United States, but he's keenly aware of everything that is going on. And this is a terrible time in the United States. 1919, the year that I referred to earlier, just a few years before Dewey travels to Turkey, is a year of tremendous violence in the United States. Of course, there's a major global pandemic happening. White vigilantes are rampaging through Black neighborhoods and are murdering people. The Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer, is leading a crusade against any kind of political dissent. This results in the arrest of something like 3,000 labor organizers and the deportation of about 1,000 what were called alien dissidents. That included Emma Goldman, for instance, who was deported to Russia. So Dewey is keenly aware of this crisis of democracy, which is taking place throughout the 1920s. And of course, this is also an emergence prior to the stock market crash in 1929. So this is also a time very much like what we've been experiencing in the United States of great wealth inequality. I think as your question has suggested, liberalism in the United States by the middle of the 20th century becomes very associated with these larger federal institutions, right? The Supreme Court declares that the segregation of schools on the basis of race is not constitutional in 1954. In 1957, the National Guard has to be sent into Arkansas to enforce that, right? So liberalism becomes very much associated with a kind of federal view, exactly as you were suggesting there. And that's where Trilling's insight about moral imagination comes into this, that we need to make sure that the moral imagination is still at the heart of those institutions, even as they're enforcing things. So I think the Deweyan response to that challenge might be that even though, and I tried to hint at something like this in what I was saying as well, even though you might look at these localities and you might say, oh, well, here's direct participatory democracy and they're racist and they're violent racists and they're doing everything possible to destroy democracy. I think that Dewey would say they don't possess that faith, that belief in others, that in trying to exclude people who don't look like them, that they are not actually embodying this kind of local practice of democracy that he's talking about. And when you think about the ways in which the Ku Klux Klan was connected to very powerful figures financially and politically in the United States for a very long time, up until my lifetime, You also see that the idea that they are sort of emerging from, the local grassroots context is maybe exaggerated, and that there is some sort of higher level coordination to what they're doing. I think that this is often the case with many forms of populism and fascism as well, where they try to identify with the people, right? But at least in the United States, right-wing populism is entirely bankrolled, managed, manipulated by extremely wealthy, powerful industrialists with lots of money who are pouring lots of money into political ads and candidates that they like. So, but I think, Dewey, again, to his, so there's the idea of diversity being at the heart of democracy. There's the idea of having that belief in the other person being at the heart of democracy, regardless, as he says, regardless of race, class, sexuality, gender, all of those things. He doesn't say sexuality. I threw that one in, but he does mention all of those other terms. And then I think Dewey is somebody who, again, as this pragmatist, he's not being monistic in his thinking about politics. He recognizes that while democracy has to involve us locally, we do need those larger institutions as well. And so there's a kind of exchange, a kind of back and forth that's taking place on those levels.
So we would suggest engaging with people who would like to basically put a bomb to democracy.
No, I mean, there is clearly a certain point where conversation ends, where dialogue ends. Yeah, I mean, there are simply just going to be fascists who are never going to be persuaded by us. It's not going to happen. And the conclusion will be either that we outmaneuver them politically, or there could be violence. Those are the options. But this is the ideal that I think Dewey wants us to be striving for, recognizing that those ugly realities exist as well. Yes.
Did Dewey have any practical suggestions?
Yeah.
For the engagement of ordinary people in society? Yeah. In democracy?
Yeah.
In technical situation where the formal system of governing and opposition political parties fails.
Yes, excellent. I think that I'm going to give you a very disappointing answer, which is I think the Deweyan response to that kind of situation, where the party in power and the opposition party have both failed, and we seem to be entirely alienated from these institutions, these political institutions. I think that Dewey is keenly aware of the fact that the United States has not, I'm going to speak to my context because I know it best. We haven't found a particularly effective mechanism for doing that. Dewey's ideas, I think Dewey mentions Tocqueville once or twice, but I think Dewey is clearly echoing some of Tocqueville's observations about democracy and the idea of very localized forms of participation. And I think in many ways, he's anticipating the thought of Hannah Arendt also, who would come along later and say, the United States, the great failure of the American Revolution was the failure to actually construct a set of institutions that would allow people to engage meaningfully and effectively in politics beyond simply voting. So what do we do in the face of that? I mean, we can view that as the impossibility of politics. We can despair, we can go home and we can watch television, right? That's one response. Or, I think that Dewey is trying to encourage these experiments in political participation, which can then build up and can build over and spill over into something that does start to reach those institutions. I think that 2016 was a disaster for us in the United States. Many reasons. One of the things, though, that happened in 2016 is that when Trump won the presidency, his party also won the two houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. So there were no checks on Trump. And due to some really smart political maneuvering and a lot of good luck, Trump's party also was able to stack the Supreme Court. And so liberals in the United States, progressives, lost everything in government. Something really important happened, though, at that time, which was the emergence of a a movement on the left to begin to engage much more in local politics, which, because liberalism in the middle of the 20th century in the United States had become associated with, the New Deal, Johnson's Great Society, right? Liberals had sort of lost touch with local politics. The conservative movement in the United States really emerges in 1964 when Barry Goldwater loses disastrously. The Republican loses the election as the Republican candidate against Lyndon Johnson. But the Republicans in 1964 begin getting on school boards and town councils, and they start engaging very locally in politics. And what they do over time is they build up a consensus that begins to bubble upward. And by 1980, they get Ronald Reagan in office. And perhaps their greater success was actually Bill Clinton in 1992, who was technically a Democrat, but every single one of his policies came straight out of the Republicans, and most of his rhetoric did too. So what has been happening, which I have been pleased to see in the United States, has been a lot more grassroots direct participation in local forms of politics that I think in the short term help to revitalize us, as Dewey is describing, but also in the long term help to build a power base that I think can bubble upwards. So that's the best answer that I can give. And I think it's not a great answer because there's so much urgency to what we're facing right now. And so the idea that, hey, we can spend 30 years building a grassroots movement, I know it doesn't help us in the moment, but it's the best that I've got, I think.
Any other questions?
When we think about the effects of Dewey's reform, especially his main concern, what we just read about how he was warning the bureaucracy regarding the centralized system.
Yeah.
And when we think about what happened after that report, and it still continues, the system is trying to be more and more centralized.
Yeah.
I share Dewey's concern. I agree with him. I don't think that we need more freedom.
Mm-hmm.
If we think about why the system or the rules not accepted his suggestions, we see that we will understand that the problem is still platonic because they were not in agreement regarding the definition of good education.
Yeah. Yes.
So
yes.
And maybe at this point, hopefully, we will again see that the most important thing is experience, as we underline.
Yeah.
That I don't think that experience will teach us, even to the most brilliant person, that at the end, you will need to make the system less centralized.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Because I mean, what you're going to end up with then is a kind of uniformity, conformity, stagnation, and all of these things are going to I think be the fruits of a system that doesn't allow people to be creative and to improvise and to adapt and be flexible. So, and going back to Dewey's pragmatism, the test of an idea is its consequences, right? So we'll see that it's a bad idea. Yeah,
I
Emma.
might hijack this, fortunately, as moderator to ask another question.
Sure.
Might be very historical, just like the question.
Of course, the historian's gonna test me on this now. I'm kidding.
So this is 1924.
Yeah.
World War I ended,
Mhm.
and if you roll back the time, just like 10 years ago,
Yeah.
Or slightly less than that, we have Woodrow Wilson in the United States,
Right.
the Democratic president.
Yeah.
And this period of time in historical scholarship lately is also called, from a global historical point of view, as the Wilsonian moment. And his role actually between the actual end of hostilities and this horrendous peace treaty coming, in between that interval, his ideas give hope for everyone. And when I was delving into that literature, like consent of the governed, classic liberal ideas, they were really like they're revolutionary for many peoples around the world, especially those movements, nationalist movements who want to emancipate themselves out of old imperial structures. even to southern states in the US and African Americans who wanted an independent state. This is serious. They made an appeal to.
Oh, yeah. That was the Communist Party's official line in the 1930s was Black nationalism.
Exactly, Paris Peace Conference. Anyway, so if you look at that literature, everything looks really quite progressive, relatively speaking, for its time, except one little thing. Classical elevation policy of the peoples who are incapable of self-governance. And Wilson talks about that a lot.
Yeah.
Good education, according to him, is necessary for democracy and self-government, but there are these people who can't do it. First, we need to show them how to do it, and that in this framework of yours, to me, sounds like Platonic. You know, like there's a way of doing this. You first need to teach people how to do it, and then you leave them to their own devices.
Yeah.
But, and this is the mandate system, right?
Right.
But of course, there's a conflict here. When you do that, you never want to leave the choice to the people.
Yes.
You
Yes.
And everything that I've been hearing from you in the last 2 days is 180 degrees opposite of that. You know, judging from Dewey's ideas. Now it's a question.
Yeah.
After a long comment.
So I'll back it up even a little bit more, and I'll just say that, you know, Wilson emerges from the progressive era in the United States. Progressive era is a moment of reform in education and society that's taking place beginning around the 1890s. And Dewey is very much a part of that. Dewey's philosophy is very much a part of this progressive movement. But the progressive movement was not a monolith. It was internally divided. And you had pacifists who were, thank you so much for coming. You had pacifists who were participants in that progressive movement. People like William James, Andrew Carnegie. I think you would put Dewey in that category as well. And then militarists. Theodore Roosevelt was a part of the progressive movement, right? And you couldn't get any more militaristic than he was, right? So Wilson's kind of emerging out of this movement, out of this historical moment in the United States that is, I think, internally contradictory and internally divided. And another area where many of the progressives got it wrong, Dewey got it right, but many got it wrong, was on the question of race. And I was actually thinking of Wilson with your question about the Ku Klux Klan, because Wilson was a great fan of D.W. Griffith's film, Birth of a Nation. This is the film that is largely credited with the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan, an organization that had been founded during the Reconstruction period after the American Civil War. And basically had died out, and then, you know, comes back with a roaring vengeance in the 1920s, largely due to this very popular film that Griffith had made. Wilson said that it was history written with lightning. Wilson admired this film greatly, and the book that it was based on as well. So Wilson's politics were, you know, it bore a lot of these contradictions, and we see that through much of the history of the United States. I want to go back, though, to another historical moment that inspires me, always inspires me. And just to, again, try to make this case for a politics that is not about sort of protecting and paternalistically controlling the people who can't govern themselves. And I want to go back to this moment of the Black freedom movement in the early 1960s that I mentioned earlier. In the early 1960s, an extremely charismatic, brilliant Black freedom movement leader named Bob Moses came up with a really brilliant idea, which was to organize a program in Mississippi, which was the harshest, most segregated, most racist, most backward state in the United States at the time. Organize a program that would bring white students from northern campuses to Mississippi to participate in voter registration drives and what were called freedom schools. Educating Black children and Black adults in Black history, Black literature, Black culture, and so forth. About 1,000 students from the North went south. Some of them were killed, many of them were beaten very brutally while they were there, and they participated in these activities. And they were coming from places like Columbia, University of California, Berkeley, Harvard, University of Chicago, very elite institutions in the United States. And I'm sort of obsessed with this project. I think it kind of embodies the best of what American democracy can be. I have talked to many of the people who participated in that event, in those politics, and they have all said the same thing to me, which was, we thought we were going there to teach sharecroppers who couldn't read and write, didn't have an education. We thought we were going to teach them about democracy. And it was exactly the opposite. We learned what democracy was from them, from their dignity, from their courage, from their respect for one another, from their ceaseless demand that they have the opportunity to exercise their rights and have control over their lives. So for me, that remains, I think, the vision of what democracy can be. And that was the moment those students, of course, went back to their campuses in 1964, September of 1964. And that was really the beginning of what we call the 60s in the United States, because every one of them was radicalized. And every one of them founded a chapter of Students for a Democratic Society, which was the largest organization of the left in the United States in the 1960s, and was focused very much on this idea of localized participatory democracy. That was their slogan, participatory democracy. And in fact, Tom Hayden, who wrote their manifesto, the Port Huron Statement, based many of the ideas there on his readings of Dewey. So that's what I say in response to Wilson.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.